Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. I'm back for Lesson 4 on Environmental Law Principles. First, let me situate this. We've gone through a narrative in the course so far where we've talked about the dominant economic paradigms that influence government policy. And we've talked about the role that neoclassical economics, the notion of the closed economy, and the neglect of environmental considerations, so the negative effect that that's had on the environment over a period of time. And now as we head into the next couple of weeks, which are about legal dimensions of environmental policy, I wanted to first give you a sense of how this lecture on environmental law principles relates to the narrative. And that is that because we've been dealing with an ideational, institutional, and process history that we're trying to transform in order to be better in terms of the way we treat the environment and, more importantly, environment economy integration. We've had to, environmental policy people over the last number of decades have had to try to instill these types of notions of integration and better incorporation of the environment into economic decision making and other factors. We've had to try to manifest those objectives into principles that we try to capture within environmental law or within international environmental agreements, which we will talk about later in the term. And so you need to understand these environmental principles in that context. They're trying to set a legal principle or a legal infrastructure around the need for better incorporation of the environment into economic decision making and better integration of the environment and economy, both in economic decision making and in policy decision making. And so a lot of young environment people don't understand the evolution of these concepts. The concepts have evolved precisely in an effort to overcome those barriers between the environment and the economy and economic decision making and in policy decision making. And if you understand the principles I'm going to talk to you about now in that context, you'll have a better grasp of what they mean and their historical legacy. All right? So do consider them in that context. Okay, let's get started. We are talking about environmental law principles first, and then we will talk about the components of environmental legislation next week. And your first short paper will deal with that topic. So the next couple of weeks are particularly important in terms of getting into the detail of what I'm saying, okay? Because that will be your first short paper. All right, that's my version of a heads up. All right, okay, let's get started on this. So I'm going to talk to you today about a number of the key principles that have tried to achieve those objectives that I just talked to you about, okay? We know about sustainable development in the Brundtland Commission. That was the quintessential effort at a macro level to come to grips with environment and economy integration, to reorient policy systems within world governments to begin to take the environment into account, to see the environment as not a barrier to economic growth, but in fact a potential to enhance economic growth, right? But do so in a way that provides for future generations as well as the current generation, right? Then we'll talk about the concept of integration of the precautionary principle of pollution prevention, polluter pays, cumulative impacts, intergenerational equity, and public participation are the concepts I want to talk to you about because they're the most prominent principles of environmental law and international environmental agreements. Now, principles are different from actual provisions of the law, what the law allows governments to do, but the principles are intended to inform the implementation of the law, any decision making by policy people about how the law will be applied, any interpretations by the courts about how the law will be applied. Principles are supposed to influence those types of decisions, all right? And that's how they're supposed to function. So let's get started on that, okay? So we all know about sustainable development, right? All major environmental laws attempt to foster the types of decision making that will lead to sustainable forms of development. That's the goal of the concept of sustainable development. Sustainable development is an approach to economic planning that attempts to foster economic growth while preserving the quality of the environment for future generations. Remember the distinction we made between environmental economics and ecological economics, between sustainable development and between steady state growth, right? This sustainable development is basically a approach that is more akin to technological positivism, more optimism. We could say is the term we use, technological optimism, and for not trying to stifle economic growth, but better integrating the environment into economic growth, right? To ensure that any growth today does not unnecessarily disadvantage the environmental assets of future generations, okay? And this notion seems very logical, right? It seems very logical that this would be a way of bridging the gap and achieving what we need to achieve, correct? But you know, its implementation has been wildly variable, right? And because complexity of environmental problems is wildly variable, okay? And so while we incorporate sustainable development into environmental law and policy instruments, and for that matter, sustainable development is also now in other laws, other sectoral laws related to forestry, mining, all these kinds of things. It's become the buzzword of the day, right? But on the other hand, how effectively are we implementing it? Because, well, it's nice to be able to say that you can have your cake and eat it too. Doing that can be tricky, right? Unless you're baking two cakes, right? It's a little difficult to be able to assure in all cases that the environment receives equal weighting to economic growth drivers that we would like to see. We would like to see more of a balance, but we know for a fact, right, when we look around, that balance is very difficult to strike, right? It's very difficult. For, you know, sustainable development principle might be relatively easy to monitor and enforce, and say in a case like forestry, where we can count forest acreage, we can count whether they're replanting, we can count, you know, where the forest will look like in 10 years because of the planting strategies and not, you know, we can say, we can apply sustainable development fairly well there, right, in forestry, and we should be able to apply it fairly well in fisheries and all that, but we haven't, right? We're trying, we're getting better, but we're still way off, right? But when you start to try to apply sustainable development or principle to, say, chemical intensification of society, you know, it's clear that we're not very successful at applying that, because chemicals, there are thousands of them, 27,000 or something chemicals in the economy, and we continue to intensify chemical use within society each and every single day of the year, for every decade. There are more chemicals, more chemical uses on our clothing and our cleaning, our industry and agriculture. And you know, we're not very good at looking at the impacts of chemical intensification, and we're certainly not in the realm of sustainable development in chemical intensification. Just like we were not in the realm of sustainable development with oil gas exploration and oil and gas consumption, combustion in this case, would being the major problem, right, for greenhouse gas emissions. Can anybody say that we were on a sustainable course there through law and principles? Obviously not. What was required there was a heck of a lot of international public protest and pressure on governments to do more, right? And in some cases, despite the principles we have, that's what it's always going to take, right? Because some of these problems are so complex. The predominant paradigm of economic growth is so powerful, right, that we're having to counter it constantly through any mechanism that it's possible to better take the environment into account in economic decision making. Okay. Now, integration is another key principle. Remember, I told you about integration of the environment and the economy, correct? The trend is psychologically, the trend is to treat the environment, you know, as a separate policy area relative to an economic planning. It still is, okay? I mean, a lot of you can listen to government debates, let's say, about mining policy or industrial policy, and you can wait a long time as they talk about, you know, things that will stimulate economic growth, interest rates, and all of that kind of stuff before you hear the concept of the environment even mentioned. Or if it is mentioned, it's mentioned as a cost that has to be borne rather than an objective that has to be achieved while you're exploiting the natural resource or while you're developing the sector, right? two completely different paradigms, two completely different in the head phenomenon, right? And so we are constantly looking for ways to integrate to force integration of the environment into the economy. And we do that typically through legislative acts or cabinet directives or other mechanisms that we have that we'll learn about later on, primarily in environmental policy too. But environmental sustainability requires that due consideration be given to environmental considerations in economic decision making. We know that to be a fact, okay? And everybody, you talk to anybody and they would all say, well, of course. But doing it in practice when the dominant economic paradigm is and the current ideation, institutions and processes and information we're giving to the citizens all pushing towards economic growth, it's a lot easier to say than to do, right? So we try to integrate, the environment into legislation so that that there is a process that the decision makers for that legislation have to go through where it's discrete, that they have to consider the environment at such and such a stage, okay? And we do that environmental impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment. We do that in various forms of regulation and various techniques we do to try to enforce a stage in the decision-making process where the environment does have to be considered, all right? And I think it's important to understand that when you're looking at legislation. Let's see, how are they handling integration here, right? The Federal Sustainable Development Act, for example, says, while the federal government acknowledges the importance of integrated decision-making, it also recognizes the importance of building environmental considerations first to ensure they are on an equal footing. Because one of the problems that we encountered was we put integration into legislation and regulation and so on, other policy instruments, and it became like the afterthought. Oh, it's one more hurdle we have to get over to get what we really want, which is the economic investment and the economic growth, right? And whereas what we're trying to do is ensure that the environment is taken into consideration earlier in the decision-making process rather than a barrier or an afterthought later in the decision-making process. The Federal Sustainable Development Act tried to do that, requiring each federal government department to produce its sustainable development strategy, for example. But also large multinationals recognizing this new reality for their consumers and for international governments and so on, are developed their own triple bottom line approaches and other approaches to take the environment into consideration earlier in their decision-making process. And that's been effective for some companies, some of the greener companies. And even some of the companies we've seen as being bad for the environment in the past, like the majors, the oil and gas majors, are now beginning to face certain realities that they got to change. And so they're developing decision-making systems to take the environment more fully into account early in the decision-making cycle. And that's called integration, okay? Many of you will have heard already of the precautionary principle, right? We try to apply the precautionary principle, but it's a very difficult concept to apply in context of the dominant economic paradigm and the pressure for growth, right? But the precautionary principle denotes a duty to prevent harm when it is within our power to do so, even when not all the evidence is not in, even when the evidence is not all in, right? We're supposed to, if we anticipate through logic and through reason that there's going to be a substantial risk, even if we don't have all the scientific data about that risk, we should take precaution, right? We should take precautionary steps, right? And we should not allow that to go forward. I mean, if we had done that with ozone depleting substances way back when, we wouldn't have had a hole in the ozone layer, right? If we had done that 30 years ago when scientists first started talking about climate change, we wouldn't have a climate crisis, would we? Right? But the reality is the precautionary principle, while it's a very important principle to include in all these instruments, it's very difficult to implement, right? Because decision making is primarily based on factual portrayals of evidence and monetary definitions of what it would cost us if we do A or B, right? When you're dealing with precaution, the very point is when you're dealing with precaution, you don't have all those facts to be able to supply those decision-making engines, right? So you're fighting an uphill battle, right? Domestic law refers to this principle in a number of different ways, right? But implementation does remain limited, okay? The bias of the system to have economic growth is rarely turned back by precaution except in cases of acute short-term risk. I mean, where we don't have all the evidence, but look, really, I mean, if we do this, people, there's going to be acute harm. There's going to be mass species die off, or humans are going to die, or whatever. Then it's a little easier to say, whoa, precaution here, right? But if you're dealing with a lot of what environmental problems in fact are, which are chronic problems that build up over many decades, the way climate change has, the way chemical intensification has, the way the ozone layer did, the way endangered species occurred. All of these things are gradual, accumulative, and precautionary principle tends to be extremely poor at addressing those particular things. Okay, it's a nice thing to wave around, but the reality is that we haven't seen it be very effective for cumulative chronic effects as opposed to acute and immediate effects or anticipated effects. Okay. Pollution prevention, that's another one, right? Pollution prevention is well known. CEPA Canadian Environmental Protection Act has pollution prevention as a major requirement. A number of different pieces of environmental legislation around Canada and around the globe talk about pollution prevention, and including within the US where it was originally evolved, okay? But it is based on the concept that prevention is always better than after the fact mitigation. We know that to be true, right? I mean, if we had prevented climate change, right, we would have saved trillions of dollars, right? Whereas, because we didn't, and now we're stuck with mitigating it, it's going to cost us, enormous sums of money, and it's going to take decades to turn the oil and gas culture around, right? But we all know that we're in for a battle that's long after many of us will have been retired and maybe pushing up daisies, all right, because we didn't prevent. We're now stuck with mitigation, and mitigation is always more expensive, right? And it's true of terms of budgetary expense, scientific and technological challenges. The courts, public opinion all get meshed up in it, because trying to encourage change once you are in the middle of it costs more, right? Now we're talking about jobs, we're talking about political leader careers, we're talking about all of those things that now get caught up in the mess because we didn't act soon enough, right? Now we have a bunch of interests that like to maintain the system the way it is now because they got everything riding on it, right? It's not necessarily because they're demons or they're evil. It's just that they've got everything riding on it, right? So now there's going to be resistance, press back, delay, give us more time to adjust, delay, and then 10 years later, delay, because they're still all embedded in the old economic system and the old economic paradigm. So bringing change forward, it becomes very difficult once you've allowed it to occur. So the principle is that if we have better foresight and we prevent pollution, we prevent these problems, then we will be in a better position to address those problems at lower cost, lower political cost, economic cost, all kinds of costs, social and cultural as well. Because we can't neglect the fact that the oil and gas also has a culture built around it, right? The oil and gas workers, their towns, their culture, their all of these things. It's not just the economy, right? It's around economic and social things. Culture builds up, right? Social ties build up, social interests build up, all of these things. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to prevent these things from getting to a point where you have to mitigate, because once you mitigate, you've got a lot of your population already committed to what's causing the harm, all right? So the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999 defines pollution prevention as the use of processes, practice, materials, products, substances, or energy that avoid or minimize the creation of pollutants and waste and reduce the overall risk to the environment or human health. Right? We can apply that in some cases, right? But it's much easier to apply at the level of at sort of what I call the micro or meso level, the micro or medium level, right? Where we already have a momentum for fixing something, let's say like preventing a particular type of chemical contaminant into water systems. Once we have that momentum going, we can work with industry to develop pollution prevention plans so they can stop doing that and they can prevent it before they also start doing that. That's where pollution prevention plans can really work, and they can be very effective. But when we're dealing with pollution prevention, when we're dealing with the macro trends like climate change, chemical intensification of society, genetic engineering, genetically modified organisms, all of these kinds of things. At the macro scale, pollution prevention, because you have to mobilize so many people to participate in the prevention, it's very difficult to do, right? And it's not something that you can do very effectively at that level within legal instruments. Though at that level, pollution prevention occurs at the level of social movements, protests, right? Young people rising up saying, take the climate into account, and so on, right? So pollution prevention is more a policy instrument rather than a political movement. And at the macro level, it needs to be a political movement, right? Polluter pays. Polluter pays is another example of one that tries to force the environment into the decision making of the economy, and it's been around for a long time, since the 1970s. The polluter pays principle has been a dominant concept in environmental law, right? But we've seen where that doesn't occur, right? We've seen abandoned oil wells in Alberta where the guys just left and didn't pay the cleanup, right? The government has to come in and pay the. So again, it's a principle that we're trying to achieve, but none of these principles, if all of these principles were as effective as we'd like them to be, we would have like less than half the environmental problems we have today. What I'm saying is that they contribute and they are very important, but it's measuring their implementation that counts, okay? Environmental economists have always understood that much environmental harm is caused by producers who externalize the cost of their activities, right? They produce a t-shirt, they sell it for $10 when it probably cost $20 to produce the t-shirt, because the other $10 they didn't pay for, they just let the dye run off in the river system, or they let the pollution run through the stack, or they whatever. Those byproducts of industrial activity are what we call externalities, okay? And if they were all fully internalized in the cost of the product, the t-shirt wouldn't cost $20. It'd cost $30 or $40 maybe, right? Because then we would be paying the actual full price of production. Okay, so the polluter pays principle was supposed to be getting at this problem of externalities. We know that we have achieved a lot in there. A lot of industrial pollution was cleaned up. There's no question. But do we still have a lot of it in the planet? Of course we do. Do we still have a lot of it in Canada? Of course we do. All right? So this is an ongoing exercise. Most environmental laws enable the development of policy instruments to force polluters to bear the real costs of production, right? But because all regulation, because all policy instruments are political, you know that politics interferes in the full implementation of this concept. Why? Well, politicians would like to protect the environment, but they would like also not to lose 2,000 jobs in their riding, right? So now you've got 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. How do you decide, right? But the problem with that, 6 of one and half a dozen of the others, you still have the dominant economic paradigm surrounding all that. Who do you think wins a lot of the times, right? So you have to realize that this is a constant agenda. That, just because you put a principle into a law or into a policy instrument, it doesn't mean squat unless you're continually monitoring and pushing this, right? And the Declaration of TSIPA states the Government of Canada recognizes the responsibility of users and producers in relation to toxic substances and pollutants and waste, and has adopted the polluter pays principle, which is true. And a lot of the time we do apply polluter pays principle, but a lot of the times we don't. And that's just the political dynamic of all policy instruments, right? Now, cumulative impacts is another concept, but it's a very important concept. But it's much more easy to apply that concept in sort of highly homogeneous or highly centralized issues, where you can look at the trajectory of those issues over a 10 or 20 year period. So cumulative effects, let's say Canadian Environmental Assessment Act is the first to really come forward in Canada with this idea of cumulative environmental effects. It aims to protect components of the environment that are within federal legislative authority from significant adverse environmental effects caused by a designated project, including cumulative environmental effects. But you notice the focus is on project there, right? So you can look at the dynamics of the project and say, look, if we build a dam here, what's likely to be the long-term cumulative impact of that if another dam is built? Or this dam, what is its cumulative impact likely to be because there was a dam built upriver 20 years ago? But that's pretty linear, right? We can see from one project to the next. We can anticipate foresight to the next, or we can look back to the previous, right? So cumulative environmental effects can be taken into account in environmental impact assessment a lot more than, say, it can be taken into account, let's say, in chemical intensification of society, or was taken into account in climate change, or could be taken into account in the loss of wildlife habitat, right? We've had lots of cumulative impacts in wildlife habitat, right? And yet we haven't stopped a lot of it. I mean, we've had some recent victories in protecting the migratory paths of the grizzly bear in the mountain ranges in the west. We've had some knowledge of cumulative impacts, right, around Banff National Park and all these kind of things, right? But again, those tend to be, unidimensional. The grizzly, we know how they migrate. Let's protect land where they migrate. Hey, good idea. Hey, why didn't we think of that before? But when you're dealing with, highly diffuse environmental problems that have serious cumulative environmental impacts, like chemical intensification, emissions of greenhouse gases, genetic engineering, these kinds of more complex, multifaceted, multidimensional issues, global-wide, accounting for cumulative environmental impacts becomes extremely much more difficult. But it's still a very important concept for us to be aware of, right? Because it is true, right? You can dump a certain percentage of chemicals into the environment, right? And say, okay, the environment will clean that up. If upriver there's more, and upriver more there's more, and now these chemicals are not only accumulating in the environment, their cumulative impacts is becoming more serious, but now there's different types of chemicals also synergistically integrating in the environment, changing their chemical form as they break down or as they join together. And so, accounting for cumulative environmental effects in that context becomes that much more difficult, right? Another key concept is intergenerational equity. It's very much like the sustainable development concept, but it's in many ways harder. It takes a much more difficult stance on the issue, okay? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has defined intergenerational equity as the issue of sustainable development referring, within the environment context, to fairness in the intertemporal distribution of the endowment with natural assets or rights to their exploitation. All right, so that's tending sustainable development now to something that's a bit more measurable. You can actually empirically measure this now, right? If we take this many fish out of the water and we have a population growth of this much that will depend on that fish in the future, are we already exceeding intergenerational equity? And without doubt, in most areas of natural capital around the world, if we apply that empirical method to that exploitation, we have exceeded intergenerational equity. I would challenge anybody to find one area where we are not challenging that intergenerational equity. Certainly in fish we are, in fresh water we are, right? One area that in certain parts of the world where maybe we're not might be forestry, might be, okay? For example, in Canada, I think we could demonstrate intergenerational equity because of some of our policies, but on fishing we couldn't, right? Certainly on chemical contamination of the natural environment we couldn't. On other types of food sources we might not be able to, right? We might not be able to do that. And we're already talking about, and when we talk about eliminating the use of some kinds of pesticides on crops, the first reaction back from communities is, well, we'll never be able to feed the growing population if you do that, right? So the logic there being is that in order to have intergenerational equity, we have to do further damage to the environment in other areas. So again, a concept that's extremely important concept, the concept of intergenerational equity. Powerful, powerful concept. And it's a concept that often powerful groups will resist because it could be a very powerful concept, right? And this would be a concept more akin to ecological economics, right? And technological skepticism, right? So ecological economists will latch on to intergenerational equity much more quickly than they would sustainable development, whereas environmental economists, right, and technological optimists would look to sustainable development and may be a little bit cautious about intergenerational equity, because if we were to look at intergenerational equity, the rate of population growth we're seeing on the planet today, where does intergenerational equity take us? right? It has to take us to a couple of things. Whether one is we either have to move to a steady state economy, slow down exploitation of natural resources, or we have to control population. How many large governments or large corporate entities want to have a debate about either of those two things? Okay, I'll leave it at that. All right. Another key concept is public participation, and that's a vital one. Environmental people are principally the people who, over the last 40 years, have been the ones pushing transparency. Public transparency of public policy, transparent processes, consultation processes. When sustainable development first came out, in the Green Plan under the Mulroney Conservatives way back when, first came out, there was chapters in there on public participation. Sustainable development, the Brundtland Report encouraged public participation. Since those times, since the late 70s and 80s, public consultations has become a whole new area of work. There are consulting firms that run public consultations. There are NGOs that mobilize people to participate in public consultations. But prior to the concept of sustainable development, right, that was not anywhere near as prominent as it is today. And trust me, not even close to as prominent as it is today. Now the public's expectations for transparency are ingrained in the political culture. But back in the 50s, 60s, that we elect the government does it, and you have a nice day, right? But not anymore, right? Now we're constantly monitoring the government. We're constantly ensuring that we have opportunities to participate in the government decision making and so on, right? That emerged in Canada from about the early 1980s onwards. It's that recent, okay? It's only 35 to 40 years where this has been completely transformed. And it's largely been transformed by the movement for sustainable development. The difficulty with consultation, of course, is it's a two-edged sword, right? To the extent that NGOs that are advocating for the environment can push for this, industry groups can also use it. Industry groups can lobby the provinces to fight the feds to fight the provinces. So it's a two-edged sword, right? It's a two-edged sword. So sometimes, but at the very least, as environment people, or as people that want to encourage change, this is a principle that we have to defend to the wall, because without it, we're in a very great deal of difficulty trying to overcome the dominant economic paradigm, right? We now have a tool, which is that if the government is misbehaving towards the environment, now we can say that in public consultations. We can work with the media to bring light to that. We can use a whole pile of instruments that we have today, or tactics and strategies that we have today that we never had if you were doing this back in the 50s or even the early 60s, right? Don't forget, the 60s hippie generation was an effort to bring all of this out, right? I mean, this was their time to fight the Vietnam War and all that. And they were a precursor very much to sustainable development. Then sustainable development opened up the public participation envelope in a way that had never been seen in human history, even in liberal democracies, okay? So sustainable development is principally responsible for that, and you can see it historically. You can see where the efforts to bring about public participation to improve environment and economy integration through public pressure was opened up by some political leaders that had imagination. The difficulty is when you open up a new arena for debate, of course everybody occupies it, right? But nevertheless, we have to continue this concept of public participation if we want to hope to bring about environmental change. Okay? So those are some of the key principles that you need to look for when you look at environmental legislation. And next week we will be doing exactly that, looking at the structures of environmental legislation. Okay, gang? Take care for now. See you next time.